Hello, my loves. This is take 2 of this video. I thought I had recorded earlier today. I updated the software that I used to record videos, and unbeknownst to me, that reset my settings to default to not record audio when I'm recording video. I'm not sure why they would think that that would be the default setting that I would want, but I am trying to see it as an opportunity. And the last time I went through this as a dress rehearsal to perhaps help me organize my thoughts in a new way. So my hope is that perhaps this time through, I'm a bit more clear and organized so that I can maybe help you get more clear who might be watching. And I'm going to preface this video by saying that I'm white, and I know that I'm white, and this video I see as for other white people who, are maybe not that far along in their own process of thinking about racism, especially structural racism, who get afraid or uncomfortable when people use words like white supremacy, who, would say, I'm not racist, who would say, it's not my fault what my ancestors did, I didn't do any of those things. I have a black friend, like any, or all of those things. I recognize that I have the privilege where I've been able to go to college, I've been able to go to graduate school, where these sorts of conversations tend to happen more. And I know that a lot of people don't have the privilege of that education, and I know that our public school system fails a lot of people. And I grew up in rural West Virginia, and I know that a lot of these issues come from poor white people who have not thought about their white privilege, who feel, and are having issues because of their economic status, but are not necessarily understanding intersectionality or, all of the other ways that they have privilege, even though they may not be doing so well, or not have the quality of life that they might have thought that they deserve, and like how even all of that is wrapped up in a lot of unconscious bias about race. So, of course, anybody can watch this video, but that's kind of the audience that I have in mind, because I know from my education and communication that it's important to be clear about your own bias as well as the audience that you were trying to send a message to. And I know that I am still learning, and I'm trying to be vulnerable and, put myself out there in a way with the intention of educating people who maybe have not thought about these sorts of things, who maybe don't realize the impact that their actions are having, and who might be able to hear it a little bit easier for me than somebody else. And, if there are things that I'm missing or things that I'm misrepresenting, I'm open to feedback or comments. Please let me know, because I'm also in this process where I'm trying to see what I don't see and understand what I don't understand. And I know it's a complicated, lifelong process, and I know that I don't have it all figured out, but I know that I can't wait until the time when I do have it all figured out to see some things. So I'm trying to use the privilege that I've had to share what I currently understand, with the hope that it might help somebody else who has not had that same privilege of education to understand some of these issues, because I know that we, as Americans, broadly speaking, are not really taught to think about things in a structural, systemic, institutional way, or to really be critical of or analyze power dynamics in a lot of situations. But it's imperative that we figure out how to do it and educate ourselves and teach ourselves, and as adults be proactive in learning the things that we needed to learn that are either a failure of the system to teach us or an intentional design to perpetuate and reperpetuate the current systems which benefit the people that are in power. So now, right, like all of that is out and kind of, put that to the side. But I know from my graduate work in the humanities that it's important to not assume that we can speak without bias, but instead to try to make our bias clear so that others can understand where we are speaking from and to whom we are speaking, so that our arguments can be judged accordingly and not meant to be taken or applied to context for which they were not intended. So, with all of that said, I'm going to start with culture. So, what is culture? Culture is a series of beliefs, practices, a worldview, a set of values, priorities that a group of people share in common, right? And so, this could be American culture, this could be, I'm in Texas, it could be Texan culture, this could be Austin culture, this could be LGBT culture, this could be feminist culture, right? Like there's so many different ways, right? Or, I'm a nerd, right? So like each fandom has its own culture, right? And then there's like subculture upon subculture within any of these categories, because there are always diverse groups of people. And even within a culture, as we are seeing right now, within American culture, there are currently divisions and disagreements about what is happening. But what I know from the education that I've received in the humanities is that we are always creating culture all the time. So we are born into a culture, and we cannot control what culture we are born into, but that culture inherently shapes and limits and defines us in certain ways. And culture is not static. It's created and recreated all the time in every moment through our agency. My master's degree was in performance studies, so from that lens, I would say that we are performing and reperforming and rehearsing our culture all the time. So within that, there is agency, but the thing about culture is that all of these beliefs and values get internalized so deeply that they become second nature, and we might not even be aware of everything that is a part of our culture. And just the way that human brains work, human brains are very good at filtering information. There is so much information coming in, even through your senses all the time, through your eyes and your ears and your nose, and we know this, I hope that we know this, or it now, that we're filtering this information all the time. It's why, you think your house doesn't smell like anything. You go away for vacation for 2 weeks, and you come back home and you realize that it does. And that doesn't mean that it's like a bad smell, right? But like, But eventually our brain just, it filters that out. Like, this isn't useful information. Your nose will pick up the smell of smoke to let you know that you left something on the stove and it's burning, because that is information that you need to assess threat and survive. But just the air that is constantly recirculating around your house, you have so much input and information coming in all the time, your brain says you don't need that, right? And it's like, that's the thing, you know, our brains have evolved to be very good at certain tasks, but we don't always get to choose, right? That evolution. And so the way that I've described it before is like, imagine your brain is running Windows 95 and Internet Explorer compared to the technology that we have now, right? Like, society has advanced so much, technology has advanced so much, and our brains cannot evolve fast enough to keep up with that. So our brains are very good at some things that we don't need them to do anymore. You know, and a lot of, you know, I'm also a drama therapist, and so learning about, you know, the nervous system and fight or flight, and a lot of those systems, right, when we start talking about racial issues, a lot of people go into that fight or flight, activated, defensive position, right? Because white people, and that's a part of white fragility, when somebody starts to talk about race, you might feel as if you were being attacked and go into that nervous system activation. But that system was designed to help us to run away from bears or lions or tigers or woolly mammoths, and, you know, to save ourselves when we were this hunter-gatherer society, and we're not in that society anymore, but we still have that nervous system and we still have that brain that is filtering out this information. And so as a person with mental illness, you know, I've had to learn when to not believe my brain, right? I've had to learn to recognize that thought is depression, that thought is anxiety, right? And to be critical of my own thoughts, and kind of going through this process of deciding, like, just because I think something doesn't mean that it's true. Like, what is true? What is the reality of the situation? And, you know, people who haven't had to deal with that, you know, maybe aren't used to being reflective about those thoughts, or being critical about their own thoughts, and just kind of accept whatever thoughts they have as true and valid reflections of reality. But they aren't always, because our brains are filtering in and out information on an unconscious level that we might not even be aware of. And the thing about awareness is you can cultivate awareness and you can learn to pay attention, but it takes practice to be good at it, because it is a skill, and it is not necessarily a skill that we are taught, because it is not necessarily in the interests of those in power that we are able to do this. And you know, I don't know if you've heard the saying, like, you can't use the master's tools to break down the master's house, right? And I think that, you know, people aren't used to thinking about power dynamics or power structures necessarily. But one of the things that I learned in graduate school was to always look at where is the power, who has power in the situation, and then working as a domestic violence advocate really just brought that message in for me on a deeper level. But you know, and just how much of our society is really founded on these abusive power dynamics and manipulation of narratives. You know, and so as a performance studies scholar and as a drama therapist, you know, I think about narratives, and it's like, you know, when someone's telling you a story, it's like, who's telling that story? What's the reason why they're telling you that story? What do they get out of that story? I feel like that was one of the most important things that my thesis advisor ever said to me, because there something had happened in one of my field sites. I was trying to write my thesis, and some of the people that I was interviewing for my research were also my friends. And so I was just having this moment of crisis where I felt like, these people were correct and they were seeing the situation clearly, but then I was afraid that my own bias or my friendship with them is getting in the way. And so I said, how do I know whether I agree with them, because they're right or because they're my friends? And my thesis advisor said to me, like, it isn't about who's right or wrong. It's about what is the narrative that they're saying, and like, what do they get out of that narrative? And so it's just a way to reframe the situation. And that's not to say that there is no right or wrong, right? But it's just like, but framing the question as who's right and who's wrong, it's harder to get a clear picture of what's happening that way. But if you ask, like, who has power, who would benefit from XYZ being true? Like, what does somebody get out of me believing this? That can bring up some interesting answers that just asking who's right or who's wrong doesn't let you get at. But also, people we're not taught critical thinking skills, right? Because again, the people in power do not want you to have the tools that you need to see any of this, because it benefits them if you just accept everything that they say is true, and you just, accept everything in the culture is true and correct, and you just go about recreating that culture as it is, because that culture is what has given them power and given them wealth, and they don't want to lose that. And if you start being critical, and not in the sense of, critical as in criticizing, but critical as in really looking closely and discerning, right? Discernment of what is happening, and is this accurate, and what do you get out of this? What do you get if I believe this? Can be an interesting question, an exercise to ask yourself, especially when things get heated, or there are these two polarized sides. Because a lot of times when there is, this polarization and this really intense emotion, sometimes what's happening is that one side is trying to say something that's true, and the other side is trying to be manipulative and twist things around and misrepresent the situation. And that's where that lens of power and control and abusive tactics of like manipulation and gaslighting, I think, can add an extra layer. And it can be so hard, because I think sometimes we don't want to believe that people are capable of that level of manipulation. But some people are, and it's a hard thing to come to terms with, but I think it's necessary to realize that some people want power and they want control, and they'll say anything if it means that they can keep it. I feel like I've kind of gotten off a tangent. So culture. So we're in this culture, right? And we have the opportunity to recreate or rehearse or reinvent the culture that we're in at any given moment. Which means that people might disagree about what it is, but we don't have to just accept everything, and we can be critical, and analyze and really consider what feels true. And what's hard is that also so much of this gets filtered through our lived experiences, and like we have experiences, and then our brains generalize those experiences to everyone, that if I've experienced this, everyone's experienced this, If I have not experienced this, no one's experienced this. You know, and that's kind of broad strokes, but it shows up in so many ways. And a lot of times, people who are in a minority, you know, whether that's related to sex, gender, sexuality, class, race, ability status, any of these things, somebody who has a different lived experience from you says, I experience the world in this way, you know, and then, you know, some people, their first reaction is just like, well, that's not true, because that's not my experience. And that's why empathy is so important, because the thing about privilege is that privilege means that there are certain things that you will just never experience, but that doesn't mean that other people don't experience them. And so I'm going to try to make some correlations to, you know, feminism or sexuality, and I think because those are minority identities that I have, and so that's how I started this process for myself, for my own lived experience. And so I'm trying to use intersectionality in a way to help people see that regardless of what the minority identity is, these same things track across all those identities, so that, you know, what is true from the lens of sexism can also be true from the lens of racism, so that maybe, you know, maybe, and I know feminism isn't even a thing that a lot of people are on board with, but maybe, right, we could draw some parallels. So from a feminist perspective, I remember reading this article that was about a class, I think probably a college class, where they were talking about, you know, sexual assault and like rape culture, and all of those sorts of things. And so the professor asked all the women in the room, and of course, like, right, anybody can be raped, but like predominantly women experience this statistically. So asked all the women, like, what do they do? Like, what practices do they engage in on a regular basis in order to protect themselves and try to prevent themselves from being in these kind of situations? Not to say it's their fault, but like, we've been socialized, right? Our culture has told us that if this happens, it is our fault, and there's so much victim blaming. So like, what practices, what do these people, what do these women have to think about all the time, you know, especially if they're out in the evening in the dark, you know, downtown or what have you? What do they do? What do they think about to try to mitigate their risk? And so these women in the class listed out all of, you know, any number of things that they do, from calling their friend, holding their keys in their hand, you know, only parking under a street light, like all of these things. You know, only going out with a friend, like never alone. You know, people joke about women going to the bathroom alone, you know, but oh, they always go in pairs, but it's like, why? Safety, right? Okay, so asked the women who are naming all of these things, then asked the men the same thing, and like, how many of them said, nothing, I don't do anything. You know, and so I think about like, just, you know, what I've read and videos that I've watched, and just trying to listen to Black people who talk about like, every time they get in their car, you know, what they're thinking about, and all of these things, you know, the second they see those lights from the police car, all of the things that they're doing, you know, every second to protect themselves, to try to prevent from getting shot. Again, if it happens, it's not their fault, but like, we're in this society where it's like, there's so much victim blaming, and so people, you know, are in this position where they have to try to protect themselves from violence that they don't deserve, because, you know, there's no one, sometimes there's no one else to protect you. So, right, and it's that same thing, right? It's that same list where, you know, and when I get pulled over by the police, you know, I'm afraid, you know, I'm not having a good time, even as a white person, but it's like the extent to which, like, I'm not, but in that moment, I'm not worried that the police officer is going to shoot me, but a Black person is. And so they are doing and thinking about all of these things all the time. And so it's like we see time and again where just walking down the sidewalk, just buying a bag of Skittles, just nothing, just asking someone to put their dog on a leash, and you could die. And because white people don't have that experience, and because they don't have to think about those things all the time, I think it can be hard for them to understand that. But that's what privilege is. Privilege just means that there are things that you don't have to think about, that there are things that you will not experience, and that you can navigate systems easier because they were designed for you. So you can just exist, right? You can just exist and sort of seamlessly, work through these systems, and you don't have to think about it. But there are other people for whom that is not the case. And so, they've done studies where same exact resume, all they changed is the name. One resume, white sounding name. And at the other resume, a black sounding name. Who gets the interview? The white sounding name. The only thing that was different was the name, but with that name comes all of these assumptions. And so that's the thing about culture, is that, we're born into a body, and whatever culture we live in, I can't control the body that I was born into. And I think, a lot of white people say that. Like, I see white people saying that, when Black people or white allies are trying to hold them accountable, they say, well, I didn't do anything. Like, I didn't have slaves. Like, I didn't colonize anything. I didn't loot anything. I didn't murder anyone, right? But it's not like, you can't reduce these things to just individual interactions, like one-on-one between people, because it's a systemic issue, right? It's not just one person, one time getting murdered by a police officer. Even that would be horrible, but it's over and over, all of the time and again, so much more than we even hear. Like, the ones that we hear about are the tip of the iceberg, and I think that's also something that people don't understand, is like, by the time these things get to this level of everyone knowing about it, I think we hear a lot more because of social media than we would if you just had to rely on the newspaper. But even so, there's so much segregation in our country, and in theory, legally, we're not segregated anymore. But if you look at the breakup of towns and where people live, and gentrification, especially Austin, but so many places around the country are still so segregated, so that white people aren't ever interacting with people of color necessarily in a meaningful way. And so if you're only ever filtering things through your own experience, there are going to be things that you're missing, because there are conversations that are happening that you are not a part of and you don't know about. And so, and I also see white people saying, having a negative reaction to the idea that racism involves power. That racism is prejudice plus power. Because, again, when people think of racism, they think of an individual person who, has hatred in their heart or something like that. But what I think sometimes white people fail to understand is that even if as an individual person, I love and care about Black people and think that we should have access to the same opportunities and the same resources, the fact is that I'm still participating in this culture and in these systems that are part of this culture, which consistently and continually put Black people in danger and deny them opportunities and segregate them and harm and murder them. And so if you try to boil it down to just individual cases of someone hating someone else, then you miss all of the ways that our culture encourages the reproduction of these systems all the time that perpetuate this sort of thing, and it's like it's not just one police officer or a dozen, right? It's like it's the idea of what the police are even for to begin with, and who white police officers feel like they're there to protect. And like so much of this again is like potentially upbringing on an unconscious level if someone hasn't done the work, and so they might think, I don't have any malice towards anyone, but somebody shared at my job, it's a study Harvard did about implicit bias, and there's so many different categories, but race is one of the categories, and so it takes you through a series of steps where there are pictures that you're sorting into, white versus Black, and then there are words that you're sorting into like good versus bad, just based on the connotation of the word, and then they will combine the two. Then they're tracking like how quickly can you sort these things from like the moment that you recognize what the picture is and like put it in a category, because like that's another thing that human brains like really evolved to do quickly, is to like see something and put it in a category. And again, it like you could trace it back to this hunter-gatherer society where like if I see movement in the bushes, like I need to be able to recognize that that's a tiger and know that I need to run away, like, but in a matter of milliseconds my body is doing that and I'm running before even cognitively like I've caught up with the fact that there's a tiger, right? Because it's like that is how humans evolved to not die. So some of this is like such like at a primal level that we're not aware of it. But so then how quickly can you sort pictures if the screen is divided into right and left, if I'm sending good words and white people, right, versus good words and Black people, and like vice versa with bad words, and like the speed at which you can do it and the difference in that speed can highlight this is a very limited test, but I think it's useful to do, and I'll put the link in the description if you want to try it out. But it's a way, it's just one tool to see like how quickly our brains can be primed to make a snap judgment that we're not even conscious of. And part of this work for white people is just in continuing to gain awareness of like all of the messages that you've internalized about race that you don't maybe even realize that you've internalized, and then looking at how your individual system, how your individual decisions also fit into a system and a pattern of behavior. And so I can give you a good example, and I think a lot of this started to crystallize for me again when I was in graduate school, and I have a lot of privilege that I was able to do that. But I took a class called the Sociology of Education, and so both sociology and social work, I think, have been very good at looking at things from a systems perspective instead of an individual perspective, and it can be a useful lens because we have so many systems in our society that we've built. And so we were and so this is the sociology of education, so we're looking at the system of education, and how that is set up. And so one of the books that we read was looking at how it is that students are chosen to be tested for and participate in gifted and talented programs. And so, you might think that, well, obviously, it's based on, whoever's smartest or whoever shows the most innate talent. But that's the thing about research, is that you can come in with whatever assumptions you have, but then you look at the data, and when they were really looking at what was happening, there are these schools where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of students, in maybe one guidance counselor. So there's no way that this guidance counselor could have a meaningful relationship enough with all of those students to know what their intelligence or potential is. And so then you also have the parents and the school teacher, who can advocate for this, but really, while you might think that these choices are being made based on some innate characteristic, what they actually found was that it was based on these snap judgments that the guidance counselor, would base it off of the type of clothing that these students wore, how often their parents were around, all of these things that have nothing necessarily to do with how intelligent they are, or what their capacity is for learning, but we're taught by association to connect all of these things. And so predominantly white students are getting chosen, and so along racial and class lines, and I'm sure also, probably males perhaps privileged too, but I don't recall that because I think it was focused on race in this case. But these choices are being made, and based on these snap judgments, and I'm sure if you asked that guidance counselor or that school teacher if they were racist or if they were biased, they would probably say no, but yet somehow when you look at the choices that they're making, it becomes clear that they are. And it can feel scary to think that you could be making choices that you're not necessarily aware of that are harming people. But if you can't even admit that that's a possibility, then you're just going to keep perpetuating it. If you are able to admit and understand that it could be happening and sit with whatever uncomfortable feelings can come up, then you can gain a new level of awareness and then have the ability to make a different sort of choice. And I think that's what people sometimes miss. And so, you might also think well, regardless of whether someone is chosen for this gifted and talented program or not, everyone's still receiving the same education. But they aren't, right? And that was the second part of the study, because, they saw that the people that end up in these gifted and talented programs then are the ones that end up in honors classes, versus the vocational track, and that determines who goes to college, who goes to graduate school, and who doesn't, and really shapes the overall career paths, that these people have access to in ways that have nothing to do with their aptitude or intelligence, and everything to do with the assumptions that people are making just based on a snap judgment that they may or may not even be aware is happening. And so then they decided to look at a 10th grade English class, one that was an honors level class and one that wasn't, and they found that these two classes, students were learning completely different things. In the honors class, they were learning critical thinking skills and really diving deep into analyzing the literature, and in the other class they were filling out worksheets, and it became very clear that some classes were preparing people for blue-collar jobs, or factory jobs or service industry jobs, and And then the other class was preparing people for white collar jobs, and being doctors or lawyers or, all of these things that have more prestige. And of course you can say, well, all jobs are valuable, and it's true, but we don't, I think we can see with the coronavirus, right? It's like somehow the grocery checkout clerk, is just as vital to our society as the emergency room doctor, but they're not being compensated in the same way. They don't have access to the same benefits or control of their schedule. And so while all jobs might benefit society in some way, and that's true, what job a particular person has a huge impact on the opportunities that they have and the amount of personal wealth that they can obtain. And, so learning about things like generational wealth, or, looking at property ownership, and all of the laws that have made it difficult for Black people to own property or to be educated, right? And so it's like there's the individual interactions that you or I might have, with any number of different people throughout the course of the day, but there's also all of these systems that we're operating in, the educational systems, the medical system, the financial system, and these systems privilege certain individuals and experiences over others, regardless of what my particular feelings might be. And that's what can be so dangerous, because people want to say that racism is just about, whether or not you have hatred for a certain group of people, but it's more than that. It's the fact that we have created systems which prioritize or privilege certain types of individuals and experiences, and disenfranchise, and, as we can see, frankly, murder others. And how is that? How is it that we have these systems if we don't agree with the situation that's happening? And how is it that we are constantly perpetuating and recreating these systems every day, moment to moment in our lives? Because that's the thing about human culture, is that like these systems are something that we created, but then we act as if they exist of their own accord, as if someone created them and now they have a life of their own, but it's only through our participation in them that they exist. So I think that's what ends up being missing, because people just want to focus on what am I doing, and I think it's because American culture has historically been very individualistic and very focused on pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and this myth of like the self-made man, and this idea that if you just work hard enough, that that the idea that the people who are wealthy or the people that have power have earned it in some way, and frankly that's just not true, because there's no way, right? I mean, if you look at Jeff Bezos, who has billions of dollars, like there's no way that a single human being could possibly do anything to earn that much more money than the average person. Especially if you know anyone who's working in a minimum wage job, and how hard those jobs are. And so how is it that you can have someone working for $7.25 an hour who's working so hard and maybe working 60 or 80 hours a week just trying to make ends meet, and then someone else is making, 6 figures, or millions or billions of dollars. And, if you really broke it down, not, maybe even working as hard as these other people, let alone 10 or 20 times harder than they are. And I think that American culture is founded on a lot of myths that can be really attractive, because I think, again, for like white, blue collar people, the idea that if they just worked harder, or that they could earn something, right? It's attractive, like the idea that it's possible for anyone to succeed, or like the idea of a meritocracy can be attractive, but it's just not the reality, and then for every 1 out of 1,000,000 people that manages to do it, that story is perpetuated as, the example that proves the rule, but that ignores the fact that for 98% of people, like, this is just never gonna happen. But if you can convince people that it could happen for them, like, that's how you keep people invested in a system that wasn't designed to benefit them. If you don't encourage anyone to think critically and to just accept what you're saying, at face value, then these people that have wealth and power can continue to maintain that wealth and power unthreatened. And, hopefully we can all see that what happens, when those systems get threatened, and the extent to which our government will mobilize to protect those systems in ways they will not mobilize to protect our health or well-being, because that doesn't benefit them. And so we can't just operate out of our own lived experience, and we can't just accept everything that we hear at face value, because people's lives are at stake. And we really have to learn how to see the things we don't see and understand the things that we don't understand. And we have to be willing to put ourselves into situations that we wouldn't normally be in, and talk to people that we wouldn't normally talk to, and listen to people that we wouldn't normally listen to. Because I think also part of this bias is that it's easier to believe people who look like you or act like you than people who might look or act differently. And that's part of my hope here, is that maybe hearing some of these things from me could reach someone in a different way. But we have to start asking questions like, who benefits from this, and how am I perpetuating this in unconscious ways that I'm not even aware of? Because that's the only way that I can start to learn how to be aware of what I don't know and haven't experienced. And part of it just starts with being able to believe somebody when they say something that doesn't match what you've experienced, especially if they have an identity that is devalued by the larger culture, because it might just be true that they're walking around in a very different world than you are, and they're having to think about things and do things that you don't have to. And and I think people want to say, like, well, I didn't do anything, as a way, or like, well, everyone has privilege, as a way to to not to have to take responsibility. The thing is, if you take responsibility for the way that you are participating in and co-creating and recreating our culture and these systems, then suddenly you have agency, where it's true that I can't control who my ancestors were or what they did, and that I would at least like to think that if that had been me instead of them, that I would have made a different choice. And so none of us can change what's happened in the past, but we can change what's happening now. And if we want to believe in this world where everybody could be successful if they work hard, and where everybody is valued equally, and where we care about diversity and all of these myths, and if we wanted to live in a world where the American dream could actually be true, then we have to start from accepting that it's not, and thinking of what we could do in this moment and every moment that comes after it to make a different choice, to make a different system, to make a different culture that actually does the things that it says that it's going to do. And I think, again, I feel like you go through, I went through, high school, and you graduate and you go to college, and then I feel like all of your professors, in college say, okay, like everything that you thought that you knew about the world and how it works is wrong. And here's, the way things actually work. And you go, what? Like, are you kidding me? And then, you graduate, and if, like I did, you go to graduate school, then again, like all of your professors say, like, okay, all of the things that you learned in college and all of the ways that you thought the world worked, like, are not true. And you think, what? Like, didn't they just do this? How could that have not been true either? And so that in itself creates a system where such a small percentage of people are having these conversations or talking about these things. And one of the things we talked about when I was in graduate school is the difference between history and historicity. And so history, especially like capital H history, like, the class that you might take is, and, hopefully we all kind of know this on some level, is a narrative, right? It's a story. And it's, primarily a story written by the victors or the people in power, whereas historicity is complicated and multifaceted and encompasses, everything that might have been happening at that moment in time. And I think people tend to think that things like history are sort of immutable or facts, or like this is just, the way things are or the way that things happen. But again, it's like it's all culture. And so one of my professors in graduate school had taught in Canada, and so talked about how the War of 1812 was taught very differently in Canada than it was in the United States. And I have a friend who, lived in a couple different states throughout high school, some in the North, some in the South, and ended up taking Civil War history multiple times through the course of that. And it was very different history, right? Like, based on, where this was being taught and who was teaching it and who was there. And so how is it, and how can it be that this situation that we might think is just factual, and what happened or didn't, that there's so much variation in the way that we tell it or the way that this information gets passed on, and again, like some of that is purposeful, and some of it might be unconscious, but I think, another thing to ask yourself is like, whose story is this? Who's telling this story? Why are they telling it? And who is or is not represented? And, I think with the coronavirus, it's like been more clear than ever that most Americans do not have the skill set to filter through information and data in a critical way to discern what is actually, relevant or accurate. And it can be so easy for people to manipulate data or manipulate narratives if they know what they're doing. And the people that are doing that kind of thing are so skilled at it that unless you're really looking and know what to look for, it can be so hard to see like the cracks or the strings of the puppets. And so I think, we could focus on the failure of society to teach us these things, or we could, use the resources and information that are available to us and the fact that we have the internet to try to keep going through this process of, when you see a piece of information, who is it from? What is their stake in this situation? What do they have to gain if you believe them? What do they have to lose if you don't? Because people's lives are at stake, and what we do matters. And as I think with the coronavirus, kind of layered over on top of all of this, it's like we are all interconnected, and I hope people are starting to see in a new way that I can't just separate myself from everyone else around me and make choices or decisions in an isolated bubble, because everything that I do has an impact that's greater than me. And that's another thing that we talk about in communication, is like intention versus impact. So when you're communicating with someone, regardless of what your intention is or what the message is that you're trying to send, what matters most is the message that the other person receives. And I think so many white people are focused on their intentions and not the impact of our actions. And that's a mistake, because regardless of what I intend, what I say or do matters. And if I actually care about people, and if I actually want to live in a society that is safe for everyone and equitable for everyone, and where people have access to the resources that they need, and where everybody has a chance to be successful or to choose to make choices and have agency and live their life the way that they would want, and to have opportunities. And if we want that world to exist, how can we keep recreating a world that we know isn't that? And I think it's just such a huge level of cognitive dissonance for some people that they want to turn away from it because it can be painful. But people are dying, and you should be uncomfortable, right? That's the thing. It should be painful, because that means that you have empathy for another person, and that means that you, somewhere in there, you want to do better. And so everything I know about defense mechanisms from psychology is that they're protective. We get defensive when we feel threatened. And that's the other thing. There's a difference between feeling threatened and being threatened. Black people's lives are actually legitimately threatened on a daily basis. And so we have to, as white people, be able to sit with fear or anxiety or discomfort and recognize when we might be trying to protect ourselves, but also realize that, like, we're not the ones that need protecting. Because society was set up to protect us, right? Like, you know, the fact that some white people feel safe to call the police because they believe that the police are there to protect them, when, like, you know, Black people are, like, not calling the police, because then they know that, like, someone's gonna die. So it's like a very different, world. I think it can be hard for people to realize that, like, the world they live in is not the world that other people live in, especially when Americans are not encouraged to travel, are not encouraged to learn other languages, are not necessarily encouraged to learn about other cultures, and we're taught to privilege our own culture over everyone else, and to think that, like, the way that we do things or the way that we think about things is the best, but it's not by a long shot. So I hope that any of this makes sense, and it can be challenging to discern between the things that you truly do not have control over and the things that you do have control over. And like I said, this is a lifelong process. This isn't something that you're going to figure out overnight. Well, one of the things that I learned when I was learning about existential psychotherapy is that the idea that not making a choice is still a choice. And that part of helping people take responsibility for their lives, and part of helping people tap into what their agency actually is, because, you know, humans will find all sorts of ways to not change and to not do things. And so we come up with all of these ways to convince ourselves that we don't have any control, as a way, again, to protect ourselves. And there are definitely things that I don't have control over. That is just a fact. But there are other things that I do have control over, and being able to understand which is which and take responsibility for what I can actually take responsibility for can give me as much agency as possible. And I think sometimes when people think about accepting that, like, everything that they've believed in isn't true and everything that they've been told is a lie, and it just feels so overwhelming. But really, underneath all of that is freedom and choice, because, you know, and I think that's why it's, like, called being woke, right? It's like you can be awake or you can be asleep. You can be in denial, or you can face reality. And the reality might be painful, but once you're aware of it, then you have a choice of, what am I gonna do in this moment to create the kind of culture and to create the kind of world that I want to live in? And how could that world actually be fair and just and equitable and all of the things that it should be? And so we don't have to feel hopeless at all about any of it. Because no, I can't control what happened in my past, and I can't control what my ancestors did, but I can control what I do. And I have a choice every day, every moment. And so do you. And I just hope that you can use that choice to help somebody else have a choice too. Because I hope that we can all agree that everybody deserves that.